Look, Beverly, it was generally speaking a very warm tone. The minister seemed very keen to emphasise the positive and to try to turn over a new leaf in the relationship between Australia and China, particularly in the wake of Anthony Albanese's relatively recent trip to Beijing, which was, of course, hailed by both sides as a real milestone in the relationship. Now, that was a key focus for the minister. He talked a lot about the need to stabilise ties between the relationship and not just stabilise them, that's the Australian government's term, but also grow them. So he sort of painted a fairly rosy picture, in other words, where both sides could make tremendous efforts to grow economic cooperation, manage differences properly, and over time develop the relationship, not perhaps into a close partnership, but into something of real substance. So overall, you'd have to say that if the minister's efforts, or if the minister's trip was all about doing one thing, at least publicly, it seemed to be about basically sending a fairly reassuring message to Australian policymakers, elites, and anyone who hoped to be listening about China's attempts to convince them that China's very serious about its attempts to rebuild the relationship. But of course, more recent events couldn't help but intrude, Beverly, and of course the recent confrontation between the HMAS Toowoomba and a Chinese warship in the East China Sea, well, that was inevitably a focus for many of the questions which came his way.
Yeah, and to that point, Stephen, both sides have very different versions. What did he have to say today?
Well, the minister's somewhat accommodating tone changed pretty quickly when it came to the encounter between the Chinese warship and HMAS Toowoomba. Just to refresh the memories of viewers, this was basically a confrontation that happened earlier this month. There was an Australian frigate, Toowoomba, that was basically patrolling waters in the East China Sea, an awfully long way off China's coast, monitoring shipping lanes going up towards North Korea. It was there as basically part of an anti-sanctions busting effort, monitoring potential ship-to-ship transfers of illegal material that might be sent to North Korea in contravention of UN sanctions. It was during that its propeller became entangled in a fishing net. A Chinese warship approached it, and then, at least according to the Australian side, it deployed its sonar while two Australian divers were in the water, leaving them with minor injuries. Now, this sent real shockwaves through Canberra because it did represent China breaking a bit of a red line, or pushing through a red line, undertaking activity that seemed to deliberately be aimed at causing injuries, however mild, to Australian personnel, and it happened in international waters. Now, the defence from the minister today was quite interesting. First of all, he effectively denied that China had done anything unprofessional to endanger the lives of the divers. Similar to the Defence Ministry, is not actually denying directly that sonar was used, but sort of implying that the Chinese actions were nonetheless justifiable. And then he basically said, well, imagine if it was an Australian ship coming relatively close to Australia. Wouldn't you want to send your own ships close by to monitor, exactly what's happening? And then on top of that, he sort of suggested that one of the reasons that they deployed this sonar and monitored this so closely was because of, as he put it, aggressive statements that Australia have made about China's coercive behaviour in places like the South China Sea or the East China Sea. So he sort of tried to heap a bit of the blame for that confrontation on the Australian side, saying, well, if you weren't so confrontational in your language about China, then perhaps the Chinese warship wouldn't have come quite so close or deployed its sonar in that way. So yeah, the tone shifted quite markedly on that incident, and I think it is a reminder that at least when it comes to these questions around national security, no matter the nice words emanating from China, its actions point to a different course of behaviour. And I think that's one of the reasons why Australia remains pretty cautious about the trajectory of the relationship in the long term, notwithstanding the fact China has taken back many of those trade measures that were coercive, notwithstanding the fact that it's taking a much more gentle tone publicly to Australia. When you look at the actions of the Chinese government, in particular, in this case, the People's Liberation Army Navy, it does paint a rather starkly different picture.
Yeah, so it's clear that the differences are going to remain. Where else did he veer, Stephen, in terms of topics, and were there any surprises in what he had to say?
No huge surprises, but a couple of other things I think worth noting. And again, the tone here is much more positive than it was when it came to that confrontation in the East China Sea. The first one was on journalist visas. You might recall that large numbers of Australian journalists have essentially left China. In 2 instances, they were effectively forced to flee China after enduring the attention of the state security services there. That includes the ABC's then correspondent Bill Birtles. Since then, Australian journalists trying to get back in have found it very, very difficult. There seems to still be some sort of informal ban on the applications that are put in, even if it isn't declared. So the minister was basically asked by an Australian journalist whether it would be possible for Australian journalists to come back in, not just to accompany the Prime Minister, as they did earlier this month when Anthony Albanese went to Beijing, but actually to once again station themselves in Beijing or Shanghai in the major cities to monitor events there. The minister, he seemed to basically say yes, no problem, that would be fine. He even suggested that there was no barrier at the moment, which does fly a little bit in the face of the experiences of Australian media organisations. Still, the fact that he seemed to open the door to this and the fact that he seemed very open to this possibility might point to a softening in the Chinese system on this point, which might indicate that in the future, Australian journalists wishing to travel to China might have an easier time of it, although we'll have to wait and see. One other thing just worth, I think, really briefly noting, Australia, of course, remains deeply anxious about China's presence in the Pacific and the fact that China has been really cultivating deeper links in countries like Solomon Islands, where it's emerged, much to Australia's discomfort, as a security player in the region. But the minister was at pains to stress, at least according to him, that China didn't regard itself as intent on establishing a sphere of influence in the region. And he also said that China remained open to, as he put it, tripartite cooperation with Australia in the Pacific on key development projects. Now, I'm not sure that there'll be a stampede of Australian officials, rushing to take advantage of this offer. I think there's still deep wells of cynicism or scepticism in Canberra about China's intentions, and there is a belief that it does want to get, at the very least, a security toehold in the region. But it's interesting that publicly China seems to be offering this olive branch. Whether this is in good faith or not, it seems aware that this perception of China as an aggressor in the Pacific might be doing damage to its image in Australia, and at the very least, it wants to try and take steps to try and complicate that picture in public.
Interesting stuff. Good to talk, Stephen. Thanks so much.
No problem. Thanks, Beverly.